Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to IMD. It's a great pleasure to welcome the ECGI Annual Conference here at IMD with Marco, his executive leader, and Per, our distinguished speaker for today. IMD has been involved in governance for quite a long time, about 40 years actually. We started educating board members in 1977, and we developed a few years ago a board center that welcomes you here, which typically works with boards very much around the world at helping them be better. Our view at IMD is that governance around the world is lacking quality and that it presents challenges to society and to us all, of course. And so we started educating boards typically one-on-one. So we have a global board program as well, but we started educating boards typically one-on-one with some major institutions around the world, the World Bank, IFC in Washington. We are going all the way to CIC, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of China, with $750 billion. We are working with one of the Middle Eastern national oil companies, which is one of the major actors as well. And of course, many of the large caps and the family businesses around Europe. And we have noticed in that world that the classical principles of independence, separation, CEO, chairman, etc., are not the foremost drivers of governance quality. We have also noticed that the sophistication of governance thinking was high at a fundamental level, but less high at a practical level. And thus we have developed from our side something that would not qualify at all for the type of quality thinking we will have today, but that is very practical at helping boards moving forwards. Basically a model of 4 pillars of success and 4 pillars of failures that we run with many boards around in the world, including institutions, non-profits like the International Olympic Committee, our neighbor that has some needs, or the Red Cross. Now, within that world, it was a privilege to hear about ECGI and to have such a distinguished organization come to us. We are indeed interested in fundamental thinking as well. IMD is very practical and very applied, but we are well aware that issues like what we are going to discuss today are very fundamental to the future thinking of governance. And we know that all the social dimensions are actually key drivers of that future thinking. We are moving very clearly 4 boards around the world from a technical governance knowledge to a values-based governance knowledge. And people are paying more and more attention to these issues. By the way, I'll mention it for the researchers that are in the room. At IMD, we are recruiting best-in-class researchers in corporate governance. So with these words, I would like to welcome Marco. Marco has a Goldschmidt Chair in Corporate Governance at ULB, and he is the Executive Director of ECGI.
Thank you very much, Didier. So I really have a short twofold task. One is to thank IMD for hosting us. ECGI's tagline, as you can see here, is leading research with global impact. We make this research available to the world free of charge, and we love partnering with organizations like IMD who help us achieve more global impact. So thank you, Didier. Now, the second task I have is to introduce our speaker, who is giving the ECGI Annual Lecture, and that's Per Stromberg, who's sitting right here. Now, you can, of course, go to ecgi.global or ecgi.org and look up Per's CV, and you'll be impressed. Not only has he published a lot in the Journal of Finance, but he's won Best Paper Prize. And not only has he won that once, but about 3 times. And I haven't done the statistics. That must be a sort of record, Per. He does lots of other things. He's most well known for his research on private equity, and he sits on the board of the 6th Swedish pension fund that I just learned only invests in private equity. Now, we had a dinner speech last night from David Frick of Nestle, who talked about the the failed private equity takeover of Unilever and how that might have destroyed the corporate social responsibility agenda of Unilever. And Per has assured me that the AP6 funding with Swedish government money would never do such a thing, although they're a private equity investor. However, that is not the topic of today. Per, that'll be next year. Per is going to talk to us about today another little topic that has occupied our minds for some time now, which is about banking. And the title of the lecture is going to be, Since You're So Rich, You Must Be Really Smart, Talent and the Finance Wage Premium. And Per has said that he would take questions. If you feel that you have to get in on this topic in between, he would take questions in between. And without further ado, Per, thank you for coming down from Stockholm and being with us here today.
Thank you. Thanks for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here in front of such a distinguished audience. So as Marco said, if you have questions as we go along, just shoot. And there's Elaine has a mic, so wait for the mic and then say your question. So we thought this title was, which by the way, this is work together with Michael Böhm, who is he's a labor economist at the University of Bonn, and Daniel Metzger is a colleague of mine in Stockholm. We thought this title was kind of cute. So I don't know if you've heard this anecdote, which supposedly is about Paul Samuelson. Okay, so that's the version I'm going to tell you. So Paul Samuelson, who was not so stupid, had an argument with some banker, a Wall Street banker, and as would typically be the case if you were arguing with Paul Samuelson, you would feel, okay, I'm losing out on this argument. So then the banker pulled, this standard card, which is, well, if you're so smart, how come you're not rich? And then Paul Samuelson replied, as a matter of fact, I am fairly rich. Now, if you're so rich, how come you're not smart? Okay, so this is in a nutshell what this paper is about. So what we're trying to understand, and by the way, just for full disclosure, and you're going to be disappointed, we're not going to fully answer the question, or the answer to this question, but the question is, why have finance wages, finance compensation, increased so much faster than compensation in other sectors over a long period of time? Okay? Arguably between sometime in the early 80s until at least the financial crisis. Okay? So that's what we want to understand. Now, I'm going to be looking at Swedish data, and you might say, who cares about Sweden except us who live there? But the nice thing about Sweden is going to be I'm going to have some very interesting data that's going to be able to shed some light on this question. But obviously, I need to establish that Sweden actually is, what we find for Sweden is kind of generalizable to other contexts. So that's where these first few pictures are about. So on the right-hand side, we see the top graph there is basically relative wages in finance for the US using American data. Now these relative wages, the way you think about these is if you take the wage of an average person working in the financial sector divided by the wage of someone working in the non-finance private sector. Okay, that ratio is what we see there. And what's been shown by others in several papers is that those relative finance wages have increased quite substantially. Now the bottom line here is the labor share in finance. Okay, so and you see this is a rather flat line. What this is telling you is that the finance sector, in terms of the fraction of employment, has been pretty constant over this period. Okay, wages have increased, employment is pretty constant. The thing that's missing here, by the way, is obviously GDP share. Okay, GDP share has gone up. So if you will, value added per employee has also gone up, but wages have gone up. The left graph shows the same thing for Sweden. Okay, so you see pretty much the identical relative wage increase. And actually, if you look carefully, you will see that the relative wage increase is even more dramatic in Sweden. Now, that's also because there are some issues with the US data. In the US, privacy concern says that if you make more than whatever, a couple of 100,000 per year, you will be coded as a couple of 100,000 per year or more in wages. Okay, so you can't identify individuals. While in Sweden, we don't care about privacy, so we have, you know, all the stuff. Okay, so the other fact that's good to know about finance wages is that this increase is particularly pronounced at the top of the distribution. So what we've done here is taken different percentiles of wages. So if you look at the right one, which is the 99th percentile, what we've done there is take the top percent owners in finance divided by the top percent owners outside of finance. Okay? And you see that that increase has been even more dramatic. Okay? However, across the whole distribution, it's been increasing. So even if you look at the median, you see that the median worker in finance, the median earner in finance divided by the median earner outside of finance, that ratio has also been increasing. Okay, so the whole distribution has increased. Now, this is not just true for Sweden and the US, but it's been shown for the UK, for Canada, for several other countries. Yes?
Does the wage include benefits?
So in our Swedish data, I'm going to... So there are, you know, how do you define compensation, right? Our main measure is going to be labor income as reported for your taxes. In Sweden, people actually kind of report stuff for taxes, so that's good. Or have to, the government keeps track of it. But that actually does include bonuses, okay? So it's the whole yearly compensation. Now, what we don't have in here is capital income. And that could be an issue for some workers who get some of their compensation as capital income. So if you're a partner in a private equity firm, you get carried interest. Carried interest is taxed at capital. We also have that, and our result, everything I'm going to tell you is going to look identical pretty much if I include capital. Problem with including capital is that there might be capital income that's not due to your employment. Okay, so that's why we choose not to include. Now, why do we care about this? Well, in Sweden, we're kind of envious of people, so we care just, you know, on itself by you know, people making more money. But there is obviously several reasons why people have been interested in this. One obviously has to do with incentives. I mean, there's a governance motivation here. If we look at the failures in the financial crisis, the failure of Lehman and things that have been going on in the financial sector, a lot of these, Wells Fargo, okay, a lot of these failures have been blamed on bad incentives, bad compensation incentives in finance. Okay, so we want to kind of understand that to understand more these governance issues and potential governance problems in finance. A lot of the proposals, by the way, going at this have been about curbing bonuses and curbing payments in finance. Now, the other literature that has been thinking about this is the Piketty type literature on inequality, because as you all know, wage inequality and wealth inequality has been increasing in the world, okay, and in most countries, within country inequality has been increasing. And there are various hypotheses for why this is going on. I'm going to talk about one in a second. But the interesting thing is that if you want to understand inequality, understanding what drives finance pay is going to provide a pretty important piece to this puzzle, because finance over this period accounts for an increasingly large fraction of these top earners and top wealthiest people. Okay, so I'm just showing you if you look at the 0.1% top earners in Sweden in 91, which is the beginning of our sample, 16% of those worked in the finance sector. By the way, the employment share of finance in the private sector is about in Sweden about 3.5%. Okay, so 16% of the top earners were in finance in 91, 29% in 2010. Okay, so basically finance workers are accounting for an increasing share of these top earners. For those of you who follow the literature in corporate governance, by the way, you might know about the Kaplan and Rao paper. The Kaplan and Rao paper is one of the first papers to kind of look at finance pay and pay differences, and showing basically the same thing, that finance workers are accounting for an increasing fraction of the top earners in the US. Now that paper it was basically a paper about CEO compensation, at least indirectly, because Steve Kaplan, who is a dear friend of mine, wanted to argue that no, CEOs are not overpaid, they're underpaid, at least compared to hedge fund managers. Okay, so that was, but this paper has a different perspective. Or we're going to hone in on a particular hypothesis for why finance wages have gone up, which has to do with what labor economists sometimes call a skill-biased technological change. Okay, so if we go back to the bigger observation that inequality in pay and wages, pay and wealth has been increasing in many countries over the last, let's say, since the 70s. A leading explanation for this has to do with what we call skill-biased technological change. Okay, so the story there is that, new technology like IT, computers, and so on, are disproportionately increasing the productivity of high-skilled workers. Okay, so if you have a higher education, if you're particularly intelligent, your productive will be enhanced more by this new IT technology. Okay, while if you're a blue collar, let's say you don't have a formal education, then you're not benefiting. Your productivity is not benefiting as much from this new technology, and that is basically means in these models people get paid their productivity. Okay, so you see that skilled workers, their wages will have increased much faster than lower skilled workers, and this is something we see in a lot of countries. Okay. Now, so this is an explanation just in general for increasing pay inequality. But there's an important and well-known paper by Philippon and Reshev that came out a few years ago in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that basically argues that, well, this skill-biased technological change, okay, is likely to be particularly pronounced in finance. That's their story. And that is the explanation why finance wages have gone up so much faster. Okay. So what's their argument here? Why would that be true? Well, one observation they make, and which is true for the US as well as Sweden as well as the UK, is that the time when you really see finance wages taking off is in the 80s, around the time the financial markets were deregulated in all of these countries. Okay. So we also in Sweden had our own big bang around the same time as the UK. And that's the point where you start seeing wages taking off. So their idea is that in this old regulated financial market, it wasn't very difficult to work in finance. Anyone could do it, because in Sweden, it's basically the government tells you what interest to charge, who to lend to, and how much. Okay, so that, so then the rest of the job you can use your own thinking for, but there wasn't so much left after that. So, but then when you deregulate markets, it becomes a more complex job. On top of that, you get IT and globalization coming into the picture. So first of all, what you actually do matters. And because of technology and globalization, what you do actually, you can apply your skill to a bigger asset base, if you will, okay? Thanks to technology. That basically means that if you're slightly better than someone else, you will be, you can potentially be paid much more, or be way more productive, because you can apply this little edge on a much bigger asset base. Okay. So their explanation for the increasing wages is exactly this. And other papers, including Kaplan and Rao, is kind of making the same point. So this is the hypothesis that we wanna go at. Now this hypothesis has two interesting predictions. The first prediction is that if the return to talent, okay, the productivity of the most talented or skilled workers, thanks to this technology, has increased more, you should expect to see two things. You should expect to see the demand from the finance industry of more talented people should be going up, okay? Because if more talented people are becoming more productive, you should want to hire more of them, okay? And the second prediction should be that this wage increase we've been observing, this relative wage increase we've been observing, should be particularly pronounced, or if not exclusively driven, by the most talented workers, okay? Because this story is really, I mean, another way, I was a bit abstract maybe when I explained the story. This is about competition for talent, okay? Why is finance salaries going up? Well, because it's more important to compete hard to get the very, very best talent, okay? But that's also when you would expect only those people who are the most talented are the ones who should see their wages going up the most. So these are the two predictions we're going to look at. Now, this first prediction, by the way, has some interesting societal implications because, you know, maybe it's not a problem if some people earn more than others and they're more productive, who cares? But there's been a worry, and this is actually an old worry. So these papers, the classic papers on this are from the early 90s, where they basically make the observation that, well, if you have this sector, this finance sector, where salaries are going up more rapidly than other sectors, obviously more and more talented people will move to that sector at the expense of other sectors, okay? So what Murphy, Schleifer, Vishny, and Baumol worry about is that, well, what's going to happen to, you know, other companies who, in their view, do more productive things, okay? When all the person who might have found, you know, discovered cold fusion doesn't do so because that person became a hedge fund manager instead, okay? So there could be negative impacts on productivity of other sectors if finance keeps on drawing in the most talented people. This is probably an argument that you've heard, okay? People teaching engineering students start making the observation that all of our smartest engineers are going to hedge funds instead of you know, manufacturing companies. So this is something we want to look at. Is there any cause for this concern? Okay, so Philip Ondreshev, as I said, they proposed this explanation, but they also provided some evidence in favor for it. And what was their evidence? Well, they basically looked at it, you know, what's the fraction, or what's the demand for workers with high education in finance compared to other sectors over this period. Okay, so they measured the skill, if you will, as having a university education, and what they show, which is what we have on these pictures too, is that if you look at the fraction of finance workers with a university education compared to the fraction of non-finance workers with a university education, take that difference, okay, that difference has been increasing over time. Consistent with, you know, skilled workers being more and more in demand by the finance industry. Now, we have two problems with this, okay? One is that, I mean, I know there are a lot of professors here, okay? The fact that you have a university education doesn't necessarily imply that you're smart or gifted, okay? We've had those students, right? So it's a pretty rough measure of skill, right? Having these rough measures, you know, when we want to look at what happens, you know, to relate skill to finance, we're interested in these very top percentiles of the earnings distribution, right? That's where a lot of the action is going on. Now, having such a coarse measure of talent is going to make it very hard to relate talent to earnings. Okay, so that's one reason. The second reason, which is more serious, I think, is that there is what we call a big compositional change in the population of, you know, in education. because what's happened in most of the countries, including Sweden and the US, that people have looked at, is that the fraction of people getting university education is trending up over time. Okay? And actually, a lot of the jobs where, let's say in 1985, you can get a job with just that job with just a high school education. For that job now, you wouldn't even get an interview if you don't have a university education. Okay? So these compositional changes can actually screw up these types of comparisons. So just to give you an example of that, this is for Sweden. Okay, what these graphs show is that the red line basically shows you the fraction of people in Sweden with a university education. Okay. The dashed line shows you the average IQ of people in Sweden getting university education. Okay, well, I'm going to. So as you see, that's going down. Okay, so what we're saying here is we're basically we're educating on the margin, less and less gifted people on average, which is very natural as you kind of increase the fraction of educated people. Okay, but that also means that these measures, the value of these measures as a measure of skill or talent is changing over time. So to get around this, we have what I think is quite unique talent measures. This is the benefit of living in Sweden, which is the Big Brother society number 1. We have administrative registry data on all Swedes between 90 and 2014 is the last year we have right now in the data set. So for all of these people, and we actually condition on being above 16 years of age, being in the workforce. So we have 72 million individual year observations. For these people, we have all sorts of socioeconomic background variables, but we know their wage and where they work, okay, or how much they report for their taxes. But then in terms of talent, we have 2 different types of talent measures on an individual basis. The first one we only have for men, okay, which is a shortcoming. On the other hand, I didn't show you that. Most of the high-paid finance workers tend to be men, okay, so we cover a lot of those. It's interesting, actually, if you look at the fraction of women working in finance is actually higher than the fraction of men working in finance, but the wages of men working in finance and the wage increase is way more dramatic for men than for women. Little fact. But anyway, so we only have this for men because military service, which was mandatory in Sweden for the people we look at, was only mandatory for men. Okay? Now the second type of talent measure that we have for everyone is grades, okay? And we're actually going to focus on people who finished high school, so we have high school grades for all of these people. The high school grades, by the way, is a bit more tricky because there you can get compositional changes over time. You can get wage inflation and so on, changes in the grading system. So we normalize that, I think, in a pretty reasonable way by actually regressing it on these other IQ measures I'm going to talk about. Okay. So as this is, I've talked about this. This is basically showing you that with these income measures you would pretty much get the same results whichever one you would look at. Okay, so what are these test scores you get from the military data? So in Sweden, this would be a 2-day test. I went through it. You probably went through it too. Okay, and there are 3 different things that we have scores on. One is cognitive ability, or that's IQ. Okay, so there's a number of IQ tests: logic, verbal, spatial, and technical, that they aggregate into 1 to 9 on a 1 to 9 scale. This 1 to 9 scale is something called a Stanine scale, which is a discrete approximation of a normal distribution. Okay? So 1s and 9s are the most unusual, and most people would be 5s. Okay? Now, one of the most unique things here, though, is that not only did you take these IQ tests, but there was a long interview with a psychologist. Okay? And the idea there was to see, how fit would you be for combat and so on. Okay? So the things that they would try to figure out is willingness to assume responsibility, independence, outgoing character, persistence, emotional stability, power of initiative. Okay? And then these interviews, the psychologist would score you on the same 1 to 9 scale. The third one that they tested was leadership. So this was specifically to see, okay, would you be suitable to be an officer? That one is also interesting, but we only have it for a subsample because they would only test you if you were sufficiently good in the other ones. Okay. And the nice thing here with these is that these are what we call inherent talent measures, and they're very stable over time. So this just shows you the distribution by year of people with 1 to 9 scores. The bottom lines there are the 1s and the 9s that are most unusual, and the top line is the 5s. Okay. Interestingly enough, you see that on the left one, which is cognitive there, you see that there's a yellow line, that's the top IQ people, accounts for about 4% of the workforce. The black one below it is the ones in IQ. They only account for, let's say, 3% of the workforce. Now, they should overall in the population be the same, which basically means that if you have too low of a cognitive score, you're less likely to be in the workforce. Okay, so that's what's going on. Now, just as a comparison, the right one shows this for non-cognitive, and actually there you see the 9 and the 1 are kind of more or less on the same level. So being a socially, disabled person doesn't stop you from being in. There's always a job for you, even if you're, weird. Maybe academia. Okay. So that's going to be our main measure, but we also have grades, and as I said, you have to process these grades a little bit. So we basically regress grades on the cognitive score, and then we use that fitted value to get the score, and we also take care of differences in school quality, etc. And we also have some university data, which I might not have time to talk too much about. Okay, so coming back to our 2 predictions, right? So this is, by the way, a somewhat tedious paper because I'm going to show you the same result in like 50 different pictures, okay? But they all say the same thing. So the first prediction is going to be if the reason for increase in finance wages is competition for talent, you would expect, given that the share of workers in finance is constant, the sector isn't growing, okay, in terms of people. Now, given that, and if more talented people are becoming more productive, you should see the average talent going up. Okay, so that's prediction 1. It would be weird if it didn't, right? I mean, so if you really feel that it's more and more important to get more talented people, you would start hiring more talented people over time, and you would see average talent going up. So that's basically, so here's the old earnings premium picture. But the left one here basically shows you the average talent of a finance worker minus the average talent of a non-finance worker by year. And we have cognitive, non-cognitive, leadership. Okay, and there's no increasing line. Okay, they're basically constant or maybe even slightly decreasing. Those are standard error bounds, by the way, which are super tight because we have so many observations. Now, one of the things that, for those of you who work in finance, before you get depressed, is it positive? It's a positive number. Okay, so the average finance worker is indeed more smarter, nicer, a better leader, and probably also more beautiful, but we don't have that score, than the average person not working in finance. But the result here is it's not increasing. The difference is not increasing. If anything, it might even be going down. Okay. Yes?
So, a naive question. Talent doesn't change over time, right?
Yes.
So there are no learning effects, there are no whatever.
Well, I mean, okay, so this is, I guess, a somewhat deep question, right? So if we go back to, this is, the scores, okay, by cohort to take these tests. And those are stable. Now, does that mean that people aren't becoming smarter over time and so on? There's something in psychology called the Flynn effect that some of you might have heard about, which basically shows that people over time, actually do better and better on IQ tests. Okay, so kids these days do better on IQ tests than kids in the 50s. Okay. Now, so there could be a Flynn effect going on here. We don't see anything like that in our data. But still, I mean, if you are competing for talent, you would want to get the smartest people in every cohort, I would think. Okay. So even if the whole everyone is getting smarter, but you really, the benefit of having the very, very smartest people is going up, you would still expect them to go for the very smartest people, I think. So I don't know if that answered your question. But I mean, our assumption is going to be that the talent is not, there are no big compositional changes in inherent talent in the way that we have with education, let's say. So that's an important assumption underlying this. Sure.
There is no size effect, right? There is no force in the finance.
No, exactly, because that's, so the reason why it's important that the labor share is constant, which is true for Sweden as well as the US, is that, you might demand more and more talented people, but if the sector is growing, you're also demanding more people, so you have to, this is going to be a compromise, right, on the margin, even if you don't want to, but just to fill the slots, you might have to go down the talent curve. But since the sector is constant, we don't have to worry as much about that. Okay, so by the way, this is for women, where we don't have these IQ and non-cognitive test scores, but we have grades, processed in a suitable way. And the interesting thing you see here is that actually, at least for some of these talent measures, the talent for women in finance is not higher than the talent of women outside of finance. So this is actually a result that's going to be more clear in some of the pictures I show later. The smartest women do not go to finance. They go, in Sweden at least, they become doctors and lawyers, actually, to a much larger extent than bankers. Okay, this is showing you, so before this was the whole population. Now if you want to spot changes in demand, you might want to look at the people who are hired in a given year, not, because the previous ones you mixed people who were just hired with people who worked in finance for 40 years. And if you want to see the changes in demand for talent, let's look at the people who are kind of recently hired. So we look at 30-year-olds over time, and actually this is what we find. Okay, so no evidence that finance is hiring more talented people over time. Maybe if anything, it goes the other way. Okay, another counter argument here could be that, well, who cares about the average worker? What I care about is the top talent. Okay? Because this is a theory of superstars. What we care about is like the super, we really, the people who really get rewarded in finance are the super smart, James Simon types. Okay? And we worry also from a brain drain point of view more about that, okay? That the top talent is going into finance. And by the way, in labor economics, as I said, the people have been doing all this work on skill-biased technical change. But that hypothesis actually changed to being job polarization. So now people talk about job polarization because it's not that jobs that require more skill are are increasing kind of monotonically in the economy, because it's what you see in the job market is that there are more jobs and higher salaries for people who are very, very good, okay, very, very highly skilled. There's actually more and more jobs created for low-skilled workers, and this kind of middle-skilled jobs that are kind of disappearing. Okay, so this is what's called job polarization. So average skill, if that's going on in finance, then these average skill measures might, be hiding that. Okay, so I think the best way to show this is basically by looking at the whole distribution. So this is maybe a slightly complicated picture, but what we do here is we take, if I go to the left one there, the yellow, okay, the yellow line represents people who have the top cognitive score, people with top IQ. So in the overall population, that's about 4% of Swedes. So what we do is we take the fraction of people in finance with the top cognitive score minus the fraction of people outside of finance with the top cognitive score. So in finance, it turns out about 5% have 9s. Okay, outside of finance, about 4% have 9s. So the difference is 1%. That's what you see there. And on this graph, we express that as a ratio. So we basically, you see that is about 1.2 for this period. So that's 5% divided by 4%. Okay. So that's what this picture is saying. And then we do that for every, or at least from 5 to 9, okay, these different cognitive groups. So if basically, according to superstar theory, we would expect the fraction of 9s in finance to be increasing faster, and maybe the fraction of mediocre people, okay, to be going down. And we do not see that. Okay. So the fraction of 9s is actually pretty constant. You see a slight increase there of 5s. Okay, so that's the middle of the road. And you see a slight decrease in cognitive 7, okay, and 8. So no evidence that even at the top of the distribution you see this massive increase of top people going into finance. So that's for cognitive. This is for non-cognitive. Okay. Yeah.
Just on the slide before, on the ratio side, and can't you see there? Maybe it's not statistically significant.
Yes, you have the bands there.
You have a drop at the dot-com bubble, and you have actually the peak with the CEO bubble.
So I'm going to show you something on engineers. So the one place where we actually see a little bit of brain drain on the margin is the smartest engineering grads, where you actually see an increase in the fraction of those people going into finance. Okay, and I think that might be, but the standard error bounds here, it's barely statistically significant. Now, non-cognitive skills, you see the same straight lines here. Okay, so no evidence that that's increasing of top non-cognitive talent going into finance. I think the thing that's interesting here, though, is that, as I said before, okay, people in finance, these ratios, the 9s, there is a ratio of 1.2. So there are like more highest cognitive people in finance than outside of finance on average. This 1.2 tells you how overrepresented are they. Okay. By the way, the most overrepresented are cognitive 7 and 8. So they are like the most overrepresented in finance compared to other sectors. Now, cognitive skills, okay, that's where you really see the top cognitive skill people being totally overrepresented in finance. So here we have a ratio of where do we have it here? These are all ratios. Okay, 2.5. Okay, so there are 2.5 times as many top non-cognitive people in finance as outside of finance. It's a huge, actually, bias. Okay, so if there's some talent that finance seems to load even more heavily on, it's the non-cognitive skills. Okay. However, trend-wise, it's not increasing here either. Okay, and if anything, here you actually see it kind of going down. Okay. And we look at leadership, we look at women separately, and by the way, here again, if you look at top women, okay, the top smartest women, the ratio there is 0.5. So that means that there are twice as many top cognitive or top, women with high grades basically outside of finance than in finance. So there it's the other way around. Another way to show the same thing, okay, is we could also look at the top earnings percentile and the average talent in that percentile. So that's a different way of kind of flipping it around. Same result, okay? So there's no evidence that the average talent in the top earnings, 1% earners in finance is increasing over time compared to other sectors. So, okay, I say so showing the same result over and over again. This one I think is interesting, given that there are some lawyers in the room. Okay, so because you may say, well, okay, I'm comparing finance versus non-finance. Non-finance is a lot. Okay, that could be everything from plumbers to lawyers. Okay, So let's look at some occupation that's also we think we consider as high skilled. Okay, or another way that I think about it is, so if my students don't go to finance, where do they go? Well, they tend to go to consulting, maybe accounting firms. My students don't become lawyers, okay? But you know, for smart kids who don't want to become doctors, they often become lawyers or business people. So let's compare, do the same comparison just to the group of LCA to start with, which stands for law, consulting, and accounting. And here you see the relative wage increase relative to those sectors, which is equally, you know, pronounced. By the way, in the beginning of the sample, finance actually earned less than these sectors on average. Okay, but at the end of the period, they earn more. And here's relative talent with respect to that sector, and it's actually going down. Okay, for at least many of these measures, and for some of these cognitive, by the way. Cognitive, you know, the average finance person is less smart in the cognitive way than the average LCA worker, turns out. But they don't make as much. Or I mean, they make more in finance. This is the same thing for IT, okay? IT, by the way, hopefully have some time to show you a slide or two on that. If you worry about like what's the big change in where people start working over this period, you know, where's the potential brain drain, quantitatively speaking, okay, over this time period? Well, if you want to characterize what's going on in the labor force, what's the big movement over this period, it's the fall of manufacturing and the rise of IT. Okay, that's the first order thing. Okay, the IT sector has risen a lot in terms of labor share of this period, and manufacturing has fallen. Okay, so this is like the first order thing. Finance is a sideshow compared to this. And this is basically showing you the relative wages in finance relative to IT, okay, and the talent difference with respect to IT. And IT people, by the way, are way smarter than the average finance person. Okay, but you know, they make less money. Okay, so this is kind of result one. That there is no change in the talent distribution, okay? So if you worry about brain drain to finance, there's no evidence of increasing brain drain to finance as a result of wages going up, okay? Now, the question is, can you still explain wages with talent? And this is a slightly different question, because if you could have the same amount of talented people in the sector, but the compensation to talent is going up, you could still see wages going up because of increasing reward to talent. Okay. Now, it would be a little bit puzzling because why wouldn't more smart people go to finance as wages go up? Okay. And we have some regressions. I don't think I included that slide. We try to kind of understand. Okay, so who goes to what explains who goes into the finance sector if it's not talent? Okay. And some of the things that explain going into finance have to do with socioeconomic background type variables. So for example, did your parents work in finance? That increases likelihood of going into finance a lot. By the way, I think that would probably be true if we did it for doctors, okay? Likelihood of becoming a doctor is probably way higher if your parents are doctors and so on. And did you go to a high school where a lot of the kids in that high school traditionally have gone to the finance sector? Well, that predicts going into finance quite powerfully. And we've actually tried in our search for what in empirical work is called an instrument. Okay, in our search for an instrument, we've looked at, did you go to a high school where a lot of the other kids in your class had parents working in the finance sector? Okay. And that actually is also true. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So, well, value. So we have it in an aggregate sense. We have that. So we have. No. So one of the things we're doing right now actually is we've been painstakingly collecting financial data on all the firms where these people work, And where we're going with the next step of the analysis is actually going to look at how profits in an individual firm relates to wages in that firm. And I predict that there's going to be a very strong relationship there. Okay. As someone said when I presented this once, well, I mean, the money has to come from somewhere, right? So, but anyway, so can we explain the wage increase with talent and characteristics? And I think the short answer is no. Okay, but let me show you what I think is the toughest, or giving the most benefit to this story would be to let's say that you think that wages should be going up particularly fast for the most talented people. Okay, and that wedge has been increasing over time. That would be kind of so you have like time and sector specific return to talent. Okay. So what would that story predict? Well, it would predict basically that smarter or more talented people should be paid more, and the difference should be increasing. Okay, so it should fan out over time. So that's basically what we have here. So one of the things you can see, which is, on maybe some of people would put it in the glass half full category, is that the cognitive 9s are paid more than the cognitive 5s, okay, on a relative basis. So because they line up like that, okay. However, for this story, it cannot explain the increase, okay, because it's not fanning out. The difference is pretty much constant. The other thing that's interesting is that the relative wages have increased across the talent distribution. And this is something I'm going to come back to in another way. So we find this for cognitive, for non-cognitive, and all these measures. Okay. So. And this is another way. This is a kind of an ugly table, I guess, but there's a lot of goodies here, so I'm going to show it anyway. Okay, and let me lead you through some of these results. So, so what we do here is that for at least part of our sample period, we have data on what job you have. Like there's a job description. So what I have here is listing all sorts of jobs we find in finance, okay, securities and finance dealers and brokers, blah, blah, blah. So we have all of those jobs. Then we look at, and that's the labor share, okay, so by the way, the biggest labor share here is what's called banking associate professionals. So it accounts for 26% of the workforce in 2010, okay. Then we have the change in labor share. So actually we see that those banking associate professionals, their share has actually gone down quite a bit over this period. Securities and finance dealers and brokers have actually increased quite a bit over this period. Then we look at the average cognitive score for each of these jobs and how that has changed over time. And what you say, basically the things that's striking here is either 0 or negative in this change column. Okay, so it's not like any individual of these groups have become smarter. Okay. This is non-cognitive is maybe a little bit more mixed, but no real trend. And the last one here, we show the finance wage premium by job. Okay. And you can do this in two ways. You can do it, take the salary of a securities and finance dealer and broker divided by the average salary outside of, in the rest of the economy, okay? So everyone else. Then you get the ratio of 3.6. Okay. You could also, and you can't do that for securities and finance dealers and brokers for reasons that will become evident, but you could also compare within group, okay? So you can take a particular job, let's say a finance and admin manager, okay? You can compare how much such a person earns if they work in the financial sector compared to what they work if they don't work in the financial sector. And then you get, for those guys, you get a number of 1.38. Okay, so this finance and administrative manager earns 38% more in finance compared to similar managers outside of finance. And that wedge has increased by a factor of 0.13 over this period. Okay, so that's the way to read this table. Now, since you have time to memorize all of these numbers, let me show you hone in on some interesting things. So I already said that the two biggest jobs here are insurance representatives and banking associate professionals, okay? No, if anything, slight decrease in cognitive score, not much going on non-cognitive score. Wage premium in particular for banking professionals has gone up quite a bit, okay? So from 1.1 to 1.5. So a lot of the increase, and actually the bulk, if you look at the aggregate figures, what drives the aggregate figures, a lot of them are driven by these banking associate professionals. Now, in Sweden, most people in finance work in one of these 4 big banks that are universal banks. They have trading, investment banking, and lending in the same kind of group, okay? So a lot of those, but they have seen, that accounts, I would say, for the bulk of the increase in these salaries. The top, by the way, group that really earns a lot more is securities and finance dealers and brokers, okay? And they have seen the most dramatic pay increases over this time, too. But there are not so many of them. Yes?
It's a bit surprising that traders have better leadership skills than professionals. Or maybe I misunderstand the...
yeah, so the average here is 6. No, that's true. But these are... so this is not leadership. This is like the non-cognitive score. Then leadership is an additional layer on that. But they should be quite correlated. Well, I mean... So it's important to make money in finance, to be kind of a... now this sounds wrong. A nice guy, maybe that's not what I want to say, but you know, having some social skills seems to help in this sector. More in this sector than in others. In Sweden, yeah. In Sweden, yeah, exactly. Okay, so anyway, so this is just showing the top paid groups and the bottom paid groups. That's the way we sorted them. But here I want to just highlight something that at least a lot of people find striking, and finally when they buy our story, okay, is when you look at jobs that is very hard to argue that they involve a very specific skill set, okay? So let's take doorkeepers and related workers, okay? So a doorkeeper in finance makes 48% more than a doorkeeper outside of finance. And that has gone up from, you know, by a factor of 0.4 over this period. Okay. So what this tells you is that this a rising tide lifts all ships. That's basically one way of characterizing these results. So, so I think we can now, at least we argue, dismiss the competition for talent explanation for the rising wages in finance, okay? Now yes? Good point. So I guess there are 2 things that you could think about. There's like, do very smart people come from abroad to work in the Swedish finance sector? And more likely, actually, is do the smartest Swedish kids who want to do finance, they might not work at Nordea Bank, they might go to Goldman Sachs. Okay. And we worry most about the second one, actually, for our results. But so first of all, you have to sort of think of, okay, does it have any bearing on these results or not? I think many of these results actually, you know, like the wage results are where just stuff, you know, rises across the line. You know, I don't think Goldman competes with doorkeepers, you know, tries to hire Swedish doorkeepers away from Stockholm to work in London. But we have actually specifically looked at emigration, and what we show is that the basically magnitudes are too small to really change anything of what I've shown. So that's the short answer. But we do quite a bit of analysis on that because we obviously worry about, you know, that prices of wages in Sweden being set in London. Okay, but there's not so much action going on with emigration as we might have thought. Yes.
A quick thought on that, and then a couple of other thoughts and questions. You might want, thank you. And I should disclose, I formerly worked in finance.
Yeah.
Your study ended in 2010, correct?
2014.
2014. Okay, because I was going to say, post-financial crisis, there was less emigration of Swedish finance professionals back to Sweden. I think if you ran it up to the present day, you would find something quite interesting going on. So just one thought for you. I mean, I just know personally a lot of that.
Yeah.
So that's just something for you to think about if you were going to rerun it. Or update it. Secondly, I think an interesting observation is that about the IT angle is finance increasingly is becoming an IT industry. And so I think, and if you look at the individuals that were hired into finance over that period, they became increasingly quantitative and technical. Why? Because the nature of securities trading, for example, became increasingly quantitative and technical.
Right.
So I don't know if you can factor out for that, but what certainly I observed in my 26 years in investment banking was an increase in talent demand and a sucking talent away from IT and from physics. So I don't know if that's something that you can break out somehow at a more micro
Actually,
level.
I have a slide on that, so I'm very happy
so you've
mentioned it.
Great.
But there was something else you said before. So we actually look at also returners. Returners have actually been happening throughout the period. Maybe a little bit of an increase after the crisis. One of the things with the crisis, by the way, is that in Sweden you do not see wages having gone down post-crisis. So the all-time high in the relative wage is actually 2014 for Sweden. It's higher than 2006. Now, it doesn't look like that in the US. I don't know if it's a data thing or if Sweden is different. But in Sweden, wages have gone up even since then.
And then, sorry,
let me just, before I take your question, your second thing here about engineers or IT people, okay? So the one place where we actually do see a bit of brain drain, okay, is engineers. So we've now called STEM, okay? So this is science, technology, engineering, math, okay? And this is the relative wages for different talent groups in STEM, okay? So if you're a smart STEM student, cognitive 9, how much do you make in finance compared to non-finance? These things kind of cluster on top of each other, but actually something seems to be happening here around the period you mentioned, okay? That there's like a increased payoff to people who are very smart STEM graduates. Okay? Now, non-cognitive doesn't seem to matter so much for STEM, actually, but it goes with the territory. But here, you also see that this is the fraction of cognitive 9 among STEM students in finance compared to outside of finance, and that's going up. Okay, so again, demand for the top talent STEM is going up, and I don't have this. There was another picture I wanted to show you. Yes, here we go. Okay, I had this for engineers too. So I don't have the right picture here, but what you can see is that the fraction of the smartest STEM students working in finance has increased. I wish I can find this picture actually. It has increased from about, here we go. Okay, let's see. I want to show this one. I don't want to hide it, okay. Here we go. So if you look at the fraction of top STEM graduates with the highest cognitive score working in finance, that's this one. Okay, so this has gone from something like 1% to around 3%. Okay, so there has indeed been a flow of the smartest STEM graduates into finance. So that's true. Now, how much do I worry about this? And that's why I want to show you. These are the sectors where the top STEM talent goes. Okay. Well, okay, there's a little bit going on here, but the big patterns here is a huge increase in this line, which is the fraction of top STEM students going into IT, and a decrease in this line, which is the fraction of top STEM students going to manufacturing. I mean, that's the big pattern. Okay, finance, there's a little bit happening, but from a societal point of view, do we worry about the smartest STEM students going to finance? I would say despite this small increase, that worry is vastly exaggerated.
And I had one last sub-question, which was your slide that broke out the securities broker dealers and showed, for example, that they were high on cognitive and non-cognitive. How are you defining those? Did that include sales staff or just traders?
We have to go with the codes that the data gives us. So this is basically, I think, self-reported by the company. So yes, there was a question there.
How you unionize the people in finance? That could explain that the doorkeepers have...
Yeah, they are, we have the big banks have reasonably strong unions. So that's true. So I guess it could be different in less unionized countries. We don't know. Okay. I mean, there's another story here. So we can spend a few minutes, but it'll take some more questions. But what could be going on? Okay, because I have something to say about some other potential explanations as well. But yeah.
Well, I have just one comment, if I may. This you probably know this famous regulation, which is CRR, capital requirements. So there is some kind of limits, of plafonds on variable remuneration. So now there is a huge competition following on the same line than Lisa said on the STEMs, digital talents and new skills in finance, which is very much related to mathematicians, scientists, and the likes. And there are limits on remuneration. So the incentives to move from this talent to move to the financial sector probably is less than before. And the thing that banking sector or financial sector competing with other sectors is almost a mission impossible because of those limits. So I wonder whether those curves going forward, how they will look like, because but that story ends in 2013. Yeah. So I don't know whether the finance sector is losing competitive advantage vis-a-vis other sector because we are not able to compete with talent, at least in Europe.
I mean, that's would be a very interesting thing to look at. One of the things we see, actually, if I go to my home turf, the hottest place to work right now in Stockholm, if you're in IT, is FinTech, which is basically start some robo-advisor or payments, some not work for a bank, but work for a startup that challenges the banks. Right now seems to be the hottest job around. Yeah.
Which is exactly where I think both of us, that was actually where I was starting to go with the questions I was asking in terms of trend.
By the way, I could also tell, this picture kind of shows it, but the general pattern you see, we looked at IT people, I think maybe we have IT people somewhere here, but if you look at people, let's say IT people working in finance make more money than IT people working outside of finance. Now, finance people working for IT companies make more money than IT people working for IT companies. And finance people working for finance companies make more money than IT people working for finance companies throughout the whole period we look at. Now, the last thing, I don't know if it's going to change or not, but those are kind of pretty robust comparisons, at least during our sample.
It might also be a bit definitional. Sorry, I don't want to monopolize the time, but because IT, as defined by companies historically, were the people who built the systems,
or pulled the cables, we call them.
The high income quantitative and high income IT skills would be defined as part of the front office. So you might have a bit of a skew in the statistics based on the definition.
Right. I think the thing that's interesting though with banking still is that, and I don't have that picture here, I think, but if you just look at the, let's see, do I have this picture? Because it would be a nice thing to end with too. Yeah, here we go. So we've looked a bit at subsectors too. So this divides in workers up to some different sectors. Now the thing you see, the top line there, the people who really have been making the most money, is securities, people working for securities firms, brokerage firms, investment banks. Okay. surprisingly. What you see there, though, is that it's actually way more cyclical than the others. And the trend is less kind of steady. You know, it's more, in good times they make, you know, amazing amounts of money. In bad times they just make not almost amazing amounts of money. Okay. Now, but the one there that actually accounts for most of the people, and you just see this steady year-by-year growth, is banks. Regular, plain vanilla banks. Okay, you just see this, you know, not very cyclical. You know, just keeps on going on and on and on, even post-financial crisis. Okay. So I would argue that to understand this puzzle, I think regulation and lack of competition has something to do with it. Now, in asset management, I think it's way more competitive, but you don't see the trend. You know, it's more. So anyway, yes. Was there any? Yes.
So I've forgotten, because I've been so entranced with the numbers as the talk went down. I've forgotten where you started with respect to GDP growth. So one story is this is a winners-take-all market. The winners are taking the bulk of the GDP growth. The other is that it's a transfer.
Yeah.
That certainly the ongoing debate with econometrics are well past my skills over whether in fact there's been a flattening of productivity gains over the last 10 years. And the only way I can sort of think about it is there are really talented people on both sides of that issue. It makes a difference as we think about this whether in fact we think that there's productivity growth that we could think about sharing and share different, or if we think that it's one group of people who are just grabbing a larger pie, a larger piece of fixed pie.
So there's a paper that has bearing on this by Thomas Philippon in the AER a few years ago. So he looks at estimates the user cost of finance. Okay. So what you see is that the GDP share of finance has gone up, and in tandem, finance wages have gone up. Now, is this because finance is just becoming way more productive than, or productivity growth is maybe super slow in other sectors, very fast in finance? He finds that that's not the case, because he basically finds that the cost of producing $1 of finance services over a long period of time is pretty much constant. Okay, so he basically finds that there's no productivity growth in finance.
No,
as far as he can.
All I need to flag is, at least as a reader of the current thing, the issue is over the measure of productivity growth, and that the standard measures of productivity growth, certainly with respect to technology, may well the standard measures understate significant levels, but I don't understand. I understand that to be significantly contested.
No, there I agree with you 100%, and you can actually add that measuring value added in finance is even harder than measuring value added in other sectors. So that's actually why I don't have a slide on productivity here, is we finally got to at least to the bottom, or closer to the bottom of that issue recently, because the national accounting for finance is A, very poor, and B, differs a lot across countries. So there are some recent papers showing how to adjust GDP numbers in finance, and we've now done those adjustments, and then you actually do see a GDP share that increases for Sweden. With the standard national statistics, actually looks like GDP share of finance is going down, okay, but they miss important components of finance in the national accounts. Yeah. Yes.
Just.
Yes.
Many thanks. Just a rather practical question. So I've observed that you noted that there's a big competition now. There are many other options for bright people to do. Usually they went into investment banking, and now they have the option to join a startup company or to do something else. So the competition for top talent has increased because there are so many options. And I wonder whether you, in your research, have included the facilitators of those executive moves, the executive search firms, the headhunters, who are largely, their fees are largely based on a percentage of the executive in his or her new position. Hence, adding some fuel to the fire. Full disclosure, I'm one of them.
We have not, but it's a very interesting hypothesis, I think. By the way, the constant fraction, I think, probably is one of the things, if you want to understand why salaries and bonuses keep going up, one of the things you see is that the fraction of the profits going to the bonus pool, or the fraction of profits going into carried interest, or whatever performance measure you want to use, has been remarkably constant over time. But what's happening is that, funds, asset bases are increasing. Okay, so if you look at private equity, it's been 20% carry since forever. Okay. But the size of the funds is going up, and that seems to at least be driving wages quite a bit. So the constant fraction hypothesis, wherever it comes from, I think is worth investigating more in the future.
Per, thank you very much. I've learned that bankers in Sweden are pretty smart. They haven't become any smarter, apparently. They've become richer, and why they've become richer, we don't know yet. But we're looking forward to your next paper that's going to answer that question for us.
Yep.
So thank you very much. We have to move on.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.